I'm Ben Ryman, and this is Behavior Speak. In this conversation, Dr. Vera Viran discusses her research on the experiences of Indo-Caribbeans in America, focusing on cultural identity, values, and the impact of socioeconomic factors. She highlights the challenges of navigating multiple cultural identities, the importance of shared experiences within community groups, and the historical context of migration. The conversation also delves into the integration of acceptance and commitment therapy in her research and the ongoing influence of traditional gender roles in Indo-American communities.
Welcome to the podcast, Vera.
Thank you for having me.
Before we get started, I just want to acknowledge I'm producing this podcast on the lands of the Klabman, Clayus, Homoko, and Comox First Nations. Grateful to be here. Vera, tell me a little bit about yourself.
I am currently all over the place, Ben. I have been teaching, so the school that I graduated from with my PhD, I'm adjunct faculty there, and I teach master's students who are getting their degrees in ABA, but their focus is on practicum and accruing their hours. So I do that. That's primarily an evening, afternoon type of thing. I teach one class consistently every term. And I try to do some lecture-based terms as the courses become available. I also work for a company that provides ABA services in New Jersey. I am currently the training supervisor for the state, and then my caseload for that particular company is in districts. So school districts who may not have BCBAs or any behavior staff contracted with them in their actual schools or have consultants coming in. My company goes in and we have services that way. And I also have a company of my own. So I'm trying to manage that. The aim is to make it interdisciplinary. Right now, the focus is just on building up the ABA side of the business.
And what's that company? Sort of what kind of work are you doing there?
For my own company, ABA. So I provide home and center-based services. Right now, like I said, I want to make it interdisciplinary in the future. So I want to have consultations available with OTs and speech therapists on site. But as of right now, I'm just trying to build up the behavior analysis department. And my main focus right now is on social skills. So that's been our biggest areas of focus. So on Saturdays, we do social skills group, which are inclusion based. So, students who may have a diagnosis, they may not have a diagnosis. It's been a great way of teaching cultural competencies, working on functional living skills in a fun, safe way where parents can have behavior staff needed if that's a concern for them.
So how did you get into the ABA field in the first place?
By accident, like most of us. I originally intended to go into school for speech therapy, but before that, I always had an interest in psychology, healthcare, that type of field. So I've volunteered at different rehabilitation centers, hospitals. I worked in daycare, instructional settings. And at the time, I believe I started as a behavior technician. I was managing a private psychiatric practice with a general psychologist. Yeah, and I saw an old colleague of mine post about just getting experience with special needs children. So I figured, why not? I needed the extra income. I was in college at the time. So I was kind of just thrown into the field, minimal training, as I'm pretty sure you're familiar with a lot of different companies. But I ended up loving it. So I decided it was a big deciding factor, but I was still going in between, should I go to speech because, this has been the plan the whole time, or should I switch over to ABA? But I decided to make the switch to behavior, and no regrets since, because ABA has been my life since that one job. I went right into my master's after that and straight into my PhD. So no break. I think I finished my master's and the week after I had set it up. So I started my PhD within the week.
So has this all been at the same school where you're working too?
No. So my master's I got from the University of Cincinnati. It was also an online program, and my PhD was from the Chicago School.
And that's where you're teaching now.
Yes.
And so what was the focus of your PhD? What were you studying?
Behavior analysis. So everything from the starting point of my master's has been strictly applied behavior analysis.
And then your your dissertation work? What was that sort of center?
So we have a lot of flexibility in terms of what we're kind of allowed to work on. Obviously, we don't want our field to be so niche where it's just, hey, we're working to with um, individuals who have developmental disabilities. And, they really encouraged us to broaden our aspects, like, kind of reach out into the different ways we can utilize behavior analysis. For me, I ended up going the ACT route. So still in the realm of like what we're kind of familiar with. But my focus was more on cultural aspects. So the big gist of what my paper is valued living with first generation Americans.
So what does that mean?
So valued living or
The whole thing, yeah. Well, first, why did you, before you maybe tell me that, why did you kind of decide to pick this topic?
okay. So I am very interested in breaking down culture. Because I feel like we say, at least in like our field, like the big areas of like what we're doing now is, like respecting people's cultures, understanding, culture plays a huge part in our behaviors every day in terms of like what we're doing in home, what we're doing outside of home, and just like diving into that a little bit more to understand how we can better serve the people and the individuals that we're working with. And it's just like the deeper you go into understanding what culture is, it's like there's more and more to unfold. So, there's this one thing where you could break down culture between like collectivist and individualistic cultures, right?
Okay, sure.
But it's so much more beyond that. Where I kind of went with my study is I ended up doing mixed methods, so both qualitative and quantitative, because with this particular study, there was a lack of literature with the population that I chose. The population that I chose is aligned with me, so kind of my background, but I wanted to make it meaningful, if that makes sense. So not just
Sure.
saying like, hey, we're going to come up with this intervention, I'm going to see if it's effective, but like really understanding where the participants are coming from, like understanding how they engaged in valued living.
The dissertation you sent me was for Indo-Caribbean first generation Americans. So tell me a little bit
Yes.
about your background and kind of how it inspired you to go this direction.
So I am a first generation Indo-Caribbean American. I was born and raised in New Jersey. My sisters as well. So I have two sisters. We were all born in New Jersey. Both of our parents were born in Guyana, which is a country in South America. All of their parents were also born in Guyana. But then beyond that, I think within the one or two generations above them, that's where the lines are blurred a little bit. We believe some of them were indentured laborers that came from India or like different parts of the world. And it's just like as I got older and I learned more about, my own culture, seeing, where our lineages are coming from, understanding even just like the mass migration that has happened, from India to the Caribbean and then the Caribbean to the United States. I feel just like socially, with like social media, especially around the time of COVID, I feel like where people had more time to look into, stuff like this because we didn't have the time before. I feel like there was a big boom of just like people exploring their cultures and just like deep diving into a lot of cool stuff. But yeah, my parents are from South America. We're West Indian. With that boom of like just resources that were available online, I think that's kind of what kickstarted the idea of like, hey, maybe I could like look into this a little bit more. I don't think it's something that I've always thought I wanted to do. It kind of just came to me based on like what was going on in the world at the time.
Tell me a little bit more about Guyana.
So it's in South America. We're on the northern coast, like northeast. But we're right on top of Brazil. We're next to Venezuela.
Okay.
Culturally, it's very, very diverse. We are primarily English speaking. Culturally, it depends on the lineage. So the reason why like I kind of I specified in my study was Indo-Caribbean is because there's also Afro-Caribbean, Chinese Caribbean, and it all goes back to the indentureship system. So like from
Gotcha.
at the time where slavery was abolished and then indentureship system came into play. That's kind of why the country itself is such I don't like to use melting pot, but like kind of a melting pot where, there'll be people that look like me who look more aligned with Indian ancestry. There's going to be people who look like they're African, people who look like they're Chinese, Portuguese. So there's no like one standard like look in the country. Very eclectic, I think is the word I'm going to use. Everyone kind of celebrates each other's holidays, practices each other's religions. So I think eclectic and diverse is the word to use there.
But then, so is what you're saying is the one thing you kind of have all have in common is sort of this lineage of indentured and slavery and whatnot?
Do you have a credential with the International Behavior Analysis Organization, the Qualified Applied Behavior Analysis Credentialing Board, the Behavior Analyst Certification Board, or would like a certificate of attendance for another organization? You can earn continuing education units by going to www.behaviorspeak.com, clicking on CEUs, and entering the 3 secret words. The first secret word is migration.
I would say so.
Like it, yeah. And so are there, and this is you might not know the answer to this question, but are there sort of indigenous Guyanans as well, or is it Guyanese, or how do you say
Guyanese.
that?
Yes. I think we spoke about this a while ago. We're going to look into it, but yes, there are indigenous communities for Guyana itself. We were British colonized at one point, and that was like the primary um, way that indentured laborers were like coming in because the British were bringing them in. I don't personally know too much about the indigenous communities there, but geographically, from just like my own knowledge with like talking to my parents and other family members, where most of the community is along this one river, and we're all
Oh,
primarily in one area, like on the coast. And that'll be like most of the Indian communities and African communities, as well as Chinese and the other smaller ones. And the indigenous people are more inland. The population of Guyana right now is about 800,000 people.
okay, and so it's not that big. And then you said you also have the numbers in terms of the laborers, and so
Do you want me to talk about that migration a little bit? Yeah, so like I said, it all kind of started with the abolition of slavery, the formal abolition of slavery, which happened in the 1800s. So the abolition of the Slave Trade Act, and then about 30 years after that, the emancipation of the Africans who were held as slaves is what marked this big shift in mass migration of indentured laborers into the Caribbean. So, because of that abolition of slavery, the colonial powers at that time had no workers. So, they had nothing to do, and they were trying to think of a new system and how to get the work done that they needed. So, indentureship wasn't new. They had this in place. The Europeans, I believe it was, yeah, the European imperials utilized this in the 17th and 18th to acquire labor from North America. So now they were kind of just like revamping it a little bit to fit the needs of like what they had at that time. So then in the 19th century, when this indentureship system is reinstated, let's say, they were kind of calling this the new slavery system. Again, just because slavery was formally abolished doesn't mean that there was all this progress that happened immediately overnight and like, people were following the contracts. So during this time, the British needed workers to go into the Caribbean. So they were contracting labor from Africa, Europe, and China, but a lot of it was coming from India. One of the main characters at this time, his name was John Gladstone, and he was a British planter, and he was located in Guyana. And he requested 100 Indians from this Dengue region, which I don't have too much information on, but they were calling it like a tribal hill
oh,
people or group.
okay, okay,
And they were noted to be the best laborers, or they worked the most efficiently. So he had requested 100 Indians to be brought into Guyana, and they tried out this new indentureship system this way, failed multiple times because of financial reasons, and also just mass death because of abuse of the laborers or working conditions. All of those little factors built into like why the system kept failing. But this whole big wave lasted from the 1830s to about 1917, which was not that long ago. The biggest wave of it happened in the 1860s, where Britain agreed to send Indians into the Caribbean to work through these contracts. And the primary work that they needed was to manage the sugar plantations. And the Caribbean is where we have a lot of that sugar production coming in. So after the system has been in place for a couple years, other imperial powers saw how successful it was and also wanted to give it a try. So the Dutch, French, Spanish, they essentially received permissions from the British, and then they started utilizing the same thing. So in total, when they had the biggest wave, about 536,000 laborers across all of the continents were brought into the Caribbean alone. But about 80% of them, which is a significant majority, they were brought from India into the Caribbean, which is why we have such a big Indian lineage within the West Indies. Yes. So the British were the main imperial powers that were utilizing the system at this time, and where they sent most of the Indians were Guyana, Trinidad, and Jamaica. But there's a big difference in between the numbers. Guyana received about 300,000, Trinidad 158,000, and Jamaica 54,000. Most of what we see here is India to Guyana, and it just so happened to be like, my family's from Guyana. So it was like kind of looking at like where we see the most migration, and it happened to be that. My particular study, I didn't want to limit it to just Indo-Guyanese. I wanted to open it up to any Indo-Caribbean, but it just so happened to be that all the participants that were included were of Guyanese backgrounds anyways.
Wow.
But I think it's just because of, again, the numbers of like how many people from India were brought into the countries.
Wow.
Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe it was because we have such a high number of Indian descent within the country. But yeah, that was the main mass migration from India into the Caribbean. There's a lot more islands that also received laborers, but for the most part, the main one was Guyana. And then again, Trinidad and some other smaller islands. And because they're smaller, they received a smaller amount of laborers.
Now, your study, the participants are Indo-Caribbean Americans, so you were sourcing your folks from the States, not from Guyana. Is that right?
Correct.
Yeah. And
Yeah, so my focus
so,
was first generation Americans. So individuals who were born here or they migrated to the United States within, like before, I think my stipulation was before their second birthday or their first birthday. I can double check back that at the end, but just so there wasn't like a big time frame of like learned behaviors from like one country to another. So that's why I had that stipulation. But it happened to be that all of the participants that were included in the study, they were all born here,
and
which
were
makes
these
most sense.
generally younger folks, or?
We had a variety of ages. It was mostly between mid-20s to mid-30s. And the study size was small too. I think so again, it was mixed methods. The first part of the study, I utilized semi-structured interviews with a group. And then the second part of the study was qualitative, where I had specific participants for single subject design. So within the group study, I believe across the two groups, I only had 6 participants.
Okay.
Yeah. So it made for a better, more intimate discussion and deeper discussions. But again, the population size of the study was very limited.
And so, who were these folks? Were these folks from the university, or were they folks from sort of the neighborhood? Where'd you find them?
I intended for the groups to be in person. At the time when I was conducting the study, I was living in New York. But like I said, I'm from New Jersey. So I was going to have one group held in New York, one in New Jersey. Because of recruitment issues, it ended up being virtual because I was not getting participants for that time. And I don't know like if you're familiar with how the research process works, but you kind of have to have everything laid out before you go ahead and run it. So we have to have like locations, sample dates, times, how is this going to work? And when you plan that far ahead, it kind of doesn't work out as you intend to, unless you can control all of those variables. So in practice, when we were actually recruiting for it, I didn't get much feed or much interest in it that way. And I didn't want to waste too much time on just like continuously recruiting and only getting like 1 or 2 participants interested here and there. So I ended up going back and requesting it to be virtual. And then once that switch was made, then I found a lot more interest. So it worked out because I was able to get people from beyond New York and New Jersey. So I think I had an individual who was from Colorado, one from Florida. So it opened it up to other areas within the United States. But again, it just so happened to be that most people's experiences were already based in the tri-state area. So there was a lot of discussions where people could like have meaningful interactions with one another because they were familiar with like different places that they were each talking about. Having that common experience, I think, was helpful for the group.
And so we'll get into the research questions in a second, but what was sort of the overall sort of intention or purpose of doing the study?
Seeing how first generation Americans engage in valued living with this idea of that we have this collectivist culture, which is our Indo-Caribbean, Indo-Guyanese background, but we're all raised in this individualistic culture. So my thinking is we have this family, we'll just say family structure, but like our smaller Indo-Caribbean culture tells us to behave this one way, but we're in American schools, we're in American work environments. How does that impact what we do, if it does
Mm,
at all? Um,
mm,
so my thinking was that it does cause some sort of conflict, and just exploring like what that conflict is, if we're aware of that conflict, how we behave if we have these conflicts. And again,
mm.
are we aware of it? How do we act upon it? So that's the main focus of kind of like everything that I did.
Got it. So when you're talking about sort of valued living, you're talking about essentially these collectivist values in that context, or?
Not necessarily, because we don't know what parts of the collectivist culture an individual may value. So it could be another person who is exactly like me, who have parents who were born in the Caribbean and they were also born and raised here. But what I value could be more aligned with my parents' culture, that Indo-Caribbean Guyanese culture. But for another person, they might be more aligned with the American and individualistic culture. So yeah, really seeing like if there is a conflict, which I presumed there was, and how those presumed conflicts impact our behaviors.
All right. So what were the questions you were asking?
Okay. So for the first part of the study, that was the qualitative aspect of it. The main research question was what themes arise when conducting virtual semi-structured interviews with Indo-Caribbean first generation Americans. During the actual groups, I'm going to start over. So the first part of the study was qualitative. That's where I had the two separate virtual groups. The overall research question was what themes arise when we conduct these semi-structured interviews with Indo-Caribbean first generation American. And I led the group by having 8 questions to guide the discussion, but because everyone was Indo-Guyanese, I believe, everyone was kind of within the same or similar age range, the discussion just flowed naturally so well. And I didn't want to disrupt that and make it unnatural. So a lot of the times I kind of just let the conversation flow because the way they're set up naturally allowed for that. The 8 questions that I used were: 1, what have been your experiences within the Indo-Caribbean community, if any, as an individual who was primarily raised in the United States? The second one was, what have been your experiences within the American community, if any, being an individual of Caribbean descent? And the way I structured it too, they're in smaller groups. So you'll see as I continue to read the other questions.
Yeah.
The next couple focus on values. So the third question was, what influence, if any, has your parents or family value on what you value? What influence, if any, has what the broader Indo-Caribbean community value on what you value? And what influence, if any, has what the broader American community values on what you value? And then the last set of questions focus on life activities and choices. So, what have been your experiences, if any, when engaging in life activities or choices that don't align with what your parents or family value? What have been your experiences, if any, when engaging in life activities or choices that don't align with what the broader Indo-Caribbean community values? And then, what have been your experiences, if any, when engaging in life activities or choices that don't align with what the broader American community values? So just based on like my own personal experience, I know that there can sometimes be a big difference between your family's values that are, within the same culture, but then also that outside community, because again, with a collectivist culture, so many other people are involved in, your own personal decision making, that I felt it was necessary to distinguish your nuclear immediate family versus that outside community, while still like getting that insight.
Okay. You said you kind of went into the study with some presumptions. Were you right, or were you challenged? And sort of what kind of surprises or kind of pieces did you kind of learn?
I think in terms of this first part with the groups, it wasn't surprising at all. I think if anything, it was eye-opening in how much other people also had to share, and they were also aware of like, hey, these are the things we're kind of going through. And it was honestly just really meaningful to be the one to kind of foster that discussion with other people, because I think that was just helpful in and of itself to have other people to connect with and be able to talk about things that maybe, like we all know that it's going on, but we don't take the time to sit down and really discuss it because we're all so busy. It may not come up. We kind of just like go with the flow and we don't really address it.
And kind of in that, with this being sort of this group piece, clearly you got a lot out of it. What did you sort of notice that these folks kind of got out of it? And sort of was this like maybe the first time they've had these conversations with, folks in sort of similar shoes?
I think let me actually go back to the results. Yeah. So I think for the participants, having this platform to discuss just like their experiences and what they've kind of gone through, a lot of it came up in like childhood experiences, how we were raised, family structure. A lot of it was school-based experiences. It felt like it was a bonding experience where people could connect of like, it sounds bad, but it's like, hey, like I went through this trauma. Like, did you go through this too? And between them, it was like, oh yeah, like that happened to me too. And not to make light of the issues, but again, it just served as a way to like connect with one another. And it's like, okay, like I thought this was only me, but it seems like everyone kind of went through a similar struggle, let's say.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? Like, what sort of struggles were folks going through?
Yeah. So the findings of the group itself, there were three main areas. So not surprisingly, one of the biggest areas that came up was culture. The other two were socioeconomics and identity. So I'll talk about identity because I think that one was the most interesting for me. And that came up a lot and it's kind of aligned with the whole purpose of the study, right? Like, are we falling in line with the collectivist values or the individualistic values? Like, where do we fit? And one of the things that came up in the group was when we fill out government forms and they ask for our race or like what our background is, this came up naturally as a question. This wasn't a guided question. We all said different answers, even though we were all of the same background. We were all Indo-Caribbean, Indo-Guyanese. We all checked off something different. Some people checked off African or Black. Some people checked off white. Some people checked off other. I personally check off other because I feel like I don't fit in any of the other categories. And I think on a deeper level, that says a lot. Like none of us know where we belong. And this idea of not belonging came up so much where it's like, I am not Indian enough to fit in with a typical Indian community. And this is not even like Indo-Caribbean, just like general like Indian communities without the Caribbean aspect. Because we live in America and we were raised here, we also don't fit in with the Indo-Caribbean communities. So if I were to go to Guyana right now, they could tell that I am not fully Guyanese. And the same thing with American. We are American. We were born and raised here, but you ask any of us where we're from, we don't say that we're American. So it's like, where do we kind of put ourselves? Do we have to put ourselves anywhere? This idea of like not knowing what to call ourselves. And there's some other research that looks into this a little bit deeper too. But a lot of West Indian people or Indo-Caribbean people, even if we're born here, we identify with the area that our parents or like our ancestors are from. So if you ask what I am, I would say I'm Guyanese. I don't automatically say American or like Indo-Caribbean. And I feel like the research shows that like most people who are of similar backgrounds, they tend to do the same thing. And I think it stems from this idea of like not knowing where we fully belong or can place ourselves. And some of the other stuff that came up with identity, it's this idea of having two worlds and kind of being at a special place where we have the power to break generational conflicts, but also upkeep traditions, keep keep our culture, and just like navigating all of that. Navigation came up a lot. Some of the participants shared independently that they were parents, and this was a big piece for them of knowing like, hey, these are traditions I do want to carry into my family, but these are the ones where I could see like, hey, I don't really think like this is going to work, especially in American culture. These types of practices are not ones that I want to continue. So having to navigate all of that on their own, because again, their generation of parents were not raised here. They were raised in a country with a completely different set of values. So now they have to kind of be the deciding factor of like, hey, what do I want to do for my family, this area? Because practices that work, in the Caribbean are not going to work in America. And just constantly having to, more so for not only for the parents, I feel like it came up with everybody of just like justifying what they're doing. So justifying like, hey, if you make a decision to go out and hang out with your friends one night, like just constantly having to justify the decisions that they're making because they value one thing that may not be aligned with what their family or their community values.
And you talked also about socioeconomics as a theme. What was going on there?
So with the socioeconomics, this was mostly household dynamics. So a lot of the participants just shared, what their home situations were like. It ended up being dynamics with their siblings. So, hey, the brother typically got to do this, the sister got to do this. A lot of what came up is parent competencies and workload and financial situations. I'll talk about the parent competency a little bit more because that came up in a couple different places. So a lot of people and myself as well, because our parents are here for the first time, regardless of if they went to school in their home countries or not, they're just not aware of the different systems that are in place in America. So, for example, filling out school forms came up. I remember when I started college, my parents did not go to college here. Going through FAFSA, applying to colleges, like doing all of that stuff is brand new. And one of the common things that came up was, hey, I don't expect my parents to know any of this, but it's also hard because like where do I go to figure it out? Because we don't want our parents to feel bad because they don't know what they don't know. So it's like little things like that, like applying for colleges, filling out forms, because if they don't know what they don't know, then they can't help us. And on top of that, we have their workloads. Everyone came, I think everyone came from a household where both parents were working. A lot of the participants had to take on like different household chores, be responsible for their siblings, cousins, stuff like that, where, it was all hands on deck and everyone's like putting the work in to do their part. Gender came up a little bit in this when it came to sibling dynamics, but I'll talk about that more with the culture. Yeah, the household dynamics, it really came down to, hey, my parents are working hard and I don't want to make their life harder by putting on like all this extra stuff. And just like how little things like that, like when I was talking about like going out, making financial decisions, kind of came back to the parent workload where, we talked about the ability to go on a vacation or taking family trips. A lot of like financial aspects came to light because of that. We didn't sit down and say like, hey, what was the financial situation? But it's like a lot of people in the group valued travel. And when we talked about travel, they ended up connecting back like, hey, when we were younger, if we traveled, we went by car. Like we were not flying. We weren't booking hotels. If we go somewhere, we're going somewhere where we stay with family. And that came up because a couple participants, like I said, they value traveling, taking their kids out to see different parts of the world. They think that's meaningful. But coming from a family where the only travel was to visit family, we have that area of, hey, my parents don't understand this and they think I'm just wasting money. So like that's like how we were able to identify like smaller areas of conflict and like flesh it out a little bit more to see, where that was.
Just in terms of travel, would there have been many or even any opportunities for these families to go back to Guyana?
Yes, I think at least two or three of them, they had parents who would go back. It's really up to the parents' choice. I believe one of the participants had asked his parents if they wanted to go back. They said no. Another participant's parents, they go back just because they still have a house down there, they maintain it. It's for combined, like both leisure and work type purposes. My parents on their own, they still have a lot of family down there, so they will continuously go back and forth, mostly just for special events, like if there's like a big wedding or something that they need to take care of down there. So it's not like the
And
country is inaccessible in any way.
right. And so like what would be sort of some of the reasons why these families came to the US in the first place?
The simplest answer would be that the American dream, right? Like they came here to get a better life, but mass migration happened in the cities. There was a bill, I can get the correct name for it. I want to say it's the Hart Cellar. Yep. So the biggest boom for mass migration from the Caribbean to the United States happened in the 60s with the passing of the Hart Cellar immigration bill. And that was passed in 1965. And there's two stipulations for that act. They allowed for individuals around the world to come into the United States, one for family reunification, so if they already had a family member living in the United States, but also for work skills. So if we just go back to that historical piece of, we come from a lineage of indentured laborers, manual labor is kind of what drove generations of families. And this is something we can touch base on after we talk about the migration, but it came down to work ethic for a lot of it and being able to put everything aside and I have this work to be done. I'm going to get it done, which again, we'll touch base on again later. But I think that is the reason why so many West Indian people and Caribbean people were allowed into the United States because the work ethic was there and they possess skills that may have been useful to have in the United States.
An interesting theme there of sort of historically it was about work as well, right? And sort of a
Yeah, and I kind of had to end my paper on that note because it wasn't something that I thought would be such a big factor. And I think it's because it's so deeply ingrained in everything that we do that it just really flew over my head. And I only kind of caught light of it as I was going through the treatment integrity process where I had one of my peers conducting the integrity checks and the alignment of some of the codes from the qualitative study. I noticed like she was categorizing them in different ways. And I was like, wait, this has to be something that's like on me because I have my own biases, obviously, of like why this would be placed in different categories. And then even when I was analyzing the quantitative study, just like reviewing the data, it ended up being inconclusive because the results didn't go like either like one way or another. But one of the factors was, hey, we come from a culture that really, really values work ethic and authority. Was I unintentionally an authoritative figure? And was this only completed because this was seen as a work task, even though the recruitment was
wow,
completely
yeah,
optional? The way that the research board, the IRB, stipulated that we can't make the compensation, like a crazy amount, like it can't be coercive. Those were all in place. Everything was good. But at the end of the day, I could be seen as an authority figure because I'm the researcher, and this is a
course.
project that's could be seen as a work project or work situation. Did you just do this because you felt like you had to? Yeah. So that was an interesting piece at the end where I felt like it's important to consider because then I thought about it on my end too. Like if I signed up for something and I know it's voluntary, I am not getting much out of it other than, like I want to do this because it's interesting. I feel like it could bring value to it. I would still consider it work. I would consider that an obligation. So
I mean, we value work ethic and we value having a strong integrity and work ethic here in a lot of ways. But I never thought about the idea that a group of folks having a really strong work ethic could have originated in, the indentured labor, slavery sort of. They generations ago pushed into labor and forced into working and forced to work in that under that power dynamic, and now it's just the way we are sort of thing.
exactly. And I think, and this is just like my own personal experience is, and I know like other West Indian families are like this too. It could be like a Saturday morning and, 9, 10 a.m. Let's say like I'm just relaxing. Our parents are up and going like it's 6, 7 o'clock in the morning. They are outside gardening or, doing chores and they don't think about it like in terms of like, hey, I have to get up and do these things. It's just naturally what they do. And I think for at least like my parents' generations, when they were in Guyana, that's what they needed to do. They didn't have that option. My father came from a family where they had to farm a lot. So they had to be up, before dawn, manage the farms, take care of animals, have a lot of those responsibilities where they don't necessarily have to do it now, but it's so routine for them. And they don't know anything else other than that. So for me, waking up at 9, 10 a.m. on a Saturday, like some people would say that's still early. But for them, it's like, oh my God, like this girl is so lazy. What is she doing? She's in bed.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
a lot of that came up within the group discussions as well. To touch back on the travel I think it stemmed from that. Traveling, like there's no quote unquote purpose to it, right? So my child is spending money for a flight to go
Mm,
see a country, to basically, for them, for a lot of like our parents' age, to just waste time. Like, why don't you save that money to, I don't know, like give to your children, or to save it, or to do XYZ? Again, not thinking that other people value travel and value, exploring other cultures and learning about different things that way. But because it could be a combination of like, one, they didn't have those opportunities when they were growing up. And also, again, if you're not doing work, then you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing.
it makes me think of a lot of the conversations I've had around intergenerational trauma and sort of all of the ingrained genetic effects of these sort of horrible things that were happening and continue to happen, and how they just, quite literally become part of one's physiology.
Yeah, that's definitely a and really interesting area. I think it would have been too much to touch in from a
Yeah.
paper, but yeah, I think it's very interesting in how our behavior plays into that. Again, it's not
Mm,
genetic factors that cause this,
mm,
but like how reinforcement works in that, how the different contingencies that we have in place all impact what we do.
absolutely. So a lot of interesting themes came out of this. How did you incorporate ACT into all this?
The ACT came more with the quantitative part of the study.
Mm,
So after the group, I started the recruitment from the end of the group, and it was open for those participants to then further their continuation into the second part. I believe there was two participants who showed that they were interested. One of the two did not complete the full baseline phase, so they were not included in that second part. And after recruitment, the ones that ended up completing the study were three different individuals. One of them completed the group study, and the other two that were included were naive to the group. So with ACT, I developed a 30-day curriculum that combined guided mindfulness videos with goal setting and self-engagement check-ins, or self-engagement tracking and monitoring. Yes. So the curriculum itself was something that I developed with the other doctors that were assisting me in the project. It was a 30-day curriculum where every day, and we utilized this we administered it through Canvas. So I was able to assign different modules for each of the days. Every day was a different mindfulness activity. And it was primarily YouTube videos, which I systematically arranged to increase in terms of the time requirement and also like how complex it was. So how I started putting the curriculum together, I went through and I coded the actual videos on what aspects of ACT that they addressed. So some of them focus on committed actions, some on detachment, like all of those different aspects. So I had those coded to see if like there was potentially any differences between, when those were administered, when not. I don't think we had enough data on that to find anything, but we have those notes in case we needed them. So we have 30 days. We started with 5-minute exercises, and then we built our way up. So by day 30, it would be a 30-minute guided mindfulness activity. With that, the participants also had to choose a self-engagement activity on their own. The reason why I didn't want to say, hey, we're going to exercise, or we're going to read a book, or we're going to do this, is because that would be based on what I value, and I wanted it to be open enough to have a discussion. So when I first met with each of the participants, I was able to ask like, hey, what is something you want to work on, so that I could ensure it's something that they valued and that they were motivated on their own to monitor and to see if that would if the intervention would be effective in that way. I think any other way it would be a disservice to the participants because I would be the one enforcing what they're engaging in. So every day they would get a mindfulness activity. They would monitor their behavior, basically do a check-in on, however we decided to track that, if it was in minutes, if it was in steps that they were taking, depending on whatever behavior that they chose. And about every week, we would do a check-in where we would see if they met any of their benchmark goals. So another part of the curriculum and intervention was setting up 3 short-term goals and 1 long-term goals to be able to better monitor their change across time. And there's some interesting research on goal setting too. I think for me, the part of ACT where I was primarily focused on was the committed actions and values section. Those two, in some of the research, they're often combined a lot. And in the research that breaks down ACT, the core processes of ACT, those two are always in a dyad together. So committed actions and values. And that's also how I measured when we were doing our check-ins. I administered the VQ scale and the CompACT scale to measure progress in valued living. And again, the 2 areas of ACT are typically intertwined.
Touched earlier a little bit on gender. Like, how do gender roles affect what are the sort of impacts of gender roles on these Indo-American communities?
The second secret word is belonging.
That's a great question. There has been some previous research that shows that first generation Americans, the males typically are more aligned with American culture, and the females are more aligned with the Indo-Caribbean or Indo-Hindu, Indo-Muslim expectations in terms of household roles, child rearing roles, the way we dress, the way we can behave. It's across settings. I feel like it's a lot more, in simpler terms, the females are expected to act more traditionally and in line with the collectivist cultures, but males are typically allowed a lot more flexibility.
And does that present sort of in present day as well?
I would say so. I think as a whole, we are becoming a little bit more flexible with the female role, but there's still going to be those ingrained expectations of like, hey, even though, like are able to like now work and have a career and go up, like this far in the ladder, you're still expected to maintain some semblance of your quote unquote, primary culture. I think it's still prevalent enough where it could be an issue. But I think and this is just like my own personal opinion, I think we're
Yeah.
making progress, but I would still like within my own family, if I leave the home or if I leave my parents' home at like 10 p.m. and I'm just like going out with a cousin, my grandma would be like, "Oh my God, like where are you going? Like you're a girl, it's really late outside." Just like little things like that where it's like, hey, my parents understand, like, hey, I'm going out to dinner, I'll be back. They know that I'm safe. But for generations beyond that, it's seen as like you're a female, you cannot be leaving the house this late because you're gonna be like it's frowned upon from the community. Like what are other people going to think? And I think for maybe a couple generations above me, because the collectivist culture is all that they know, what the group thinks, and which is part of the reason why I asked what they value or like if you make life choices that aren't aligned with the broader community, it's because there's this idea of like, oh my God, what are other people going to think? They're going to think you're out doing whatever versus, for me, I value, going out to try new foods with my cousin. Like I know that I'm not out there doing anything crazy, but if someone from the broader community see that I'm out and maybe I'm consuming alcohol, I know that it's safe for me to consume alcohol. I am having one drink. I'm not driving, but it's this idea of like, oh my God, what are people going to think about you? What are they going to think about our family? They're going to think that we're doing something wrong. And I think for a lot of people too, it stems from that idea of what are the other people going to think about us and what we're doing. And then it comes back to us or, that generation's kids, their grandkids, because they don't want to be, I think, quote unquote, shunned or like looked down upon.
Just going back a bit to the ACT piece, were there any? Because I think the results were a bit inconclusive. So what were kind of some of the challenges and What do you think were the issues there?
So for one of the participants, it ended up being just some unexpected challenges. So there was a death in her family, and then she also got a promotion
Oh,
at her job that included multiple days of like all day trainings, and her specific goal was reading. So it just became a huge barrier for her. So I think, only completed about 50% of the curriculum, but she was able to show progress on some of the scales. For one of the other participants, and I could pull up this too. Would it be helpful if I gave a quick summary of each of the three?
sure.
Yes. So for the ACT piece, like I said, they each chose their self-engagement activity. For Evelyn, that would be the participant that also was included in the group study. Her data was interesting because it did not make sense. Duration of her self-care engagement, and she was working, her goal was activity in terms of like working out. It wasn't too specific into like what the activity was, but essentially she was working out. The duration of that increased from baseline to intervention, and then again from intervention to maintenance. So on the graph it looks great. So you would think on top of that she met all of her short-term goals and the long-term goal. So you would think that on the scales, it would be aligned with that. But on the VQ scale, progress showed an increase. No, I'm sorry, it was mixed. You would think progress showed an increase and then obstruction showed a decrease, but her results were the opposite. So her progress declined and the obstruction increased. And then for the comp act, the other scale that I used to measure, the VA subscale, which is the valued action, that only showed a slight increase, even though with the data, the actual data that we were collecting, everything else was increasing and was met. And it was this particular participant where I began thinking about, maybe it's not actually valued as much as I think it's value versus obligation. Because she committed to participating in this project, maybe
Yeah.
there was at a point where it wasn't a valued activity for her. This was more of, I have to do this because I said I was going to do it. So yeah, her results were definitely interesting. The second participant, Mardai, she was the one who I mentioned had a death in the family, and then she got a promotion, so she was only able to complete about half of the curriculum. But even with that, uh she obviously had non-engagement for multiple weeks. She didn't meet any of her benchmark goals, but her progress scale showed an increase. Her obstruction scale showed a decrease, and the comp active VA subscale also showed an increase. So all of those together, aside from the curriculum engagement, all were in the direction that I would have hoped for them to go in. And overall, all of the scales showed that there was marked increase in her psychological flexibility, which is the overall goal of what ACT is. And then the third participant, I think she made the most meaningful gains. So there was a slight decrease in her self-engagement activity from baseline to intervention. Everything else was as a researcher would hope. Everything was maintained. Her self-care engagement activity was going on a walk, and she preferred to walk with her dog. But in her area, there was a couple days where there was a heat wave, there was torrential downpour, and that impacted her engagement. But again, other than that, she did amazing. She had increased, again, from intervention to maintenance. She met all of her benchmark goals. VQ progress showed an increase, obstruction showed a decrease, and all of the other scales, I think, were in yeah, every single subscale, as well as the main scores for Compt AC, all showed increase. So overall, this third participant is the one that made the most meaningful gains across all of the scales, all of the activities. But because she made great increase, the second one was inconclusive, and then the first one were inconsistent. We had to come to the conclusion that the results were inconclusive because they were all so different.
But it certainly sounds like there's some hope for ACT with this population.
I think so. I do think so. I think it was eye-opening for me as a researcher after the fact, because it's like, wow, I never thought like these could be factors. And that's because of my own upbringing. And I think I was so aligned with the participants that I didn't see it from a researcher perspective of like, hey, this is an obligation or this could be like misconstrued in a different way. So yeah, I think it was definitely meaningful, but ACT I think has great applications for not only this population, but for a lot of different populations if used correctly.
So, what might be kind of some of the sort of implications for clinical practice? I mean, for behavior analysts and others in terms of some of this work? Like, what are maybe some key cultural competencies we should develop? Or how should we be modifying interventions? What kinds of considerations should we?
And I think that's where we can take these results and apply them the most.
Hmm.
It could go as far as into like policy change or, like more into neuro and, studying of culture. But I think in terms of actual change that we can make, I agree with you. It should be in cultural competencies we can take. And it really just boils down to asking people what they want or what is important to them. And even for me, I can go into a house and it could be a family who is West Indian, but every family is different. Just because I value, one thing or one area doesn't necessarily mean that family also values the same. So I think best practice for behavior analysts, like anybody working within this field, not only behavior analysis, but counselors, social workers, people in school districts, just having open discussions and not assuming, I think is the best way to start, but also familiarizing yourself with the historical context of people's backgrounds, which I know is not
Yeah.
always feasible. It's not. We don't have the time to sit back and like read all the research on every single person's culture, but just like having a general idea of like, hey, where does this group come from? Like kind of like what you said, like you had no idea of the connection of like indentured laborers on the West Indian culture.
Mm-hmm.
But this could be so informative to a practitioner who has never worked with someone who's West Indian because they could then see why a parent may be pushing their child to do 2 hours of homework once they come home from school, or, they're hesitant of allowing this child to have a 5-minute break on the iPad in between their works. I think it helps in terms of understanding the barriers that we may be facing in clinical practice.
Yeah.
Because obviously, when we're trained, the research says like ABA should work like this, and this. If we have an ideal intervention, these are the things that we have in place. I'm sure in application, a lot of that is not feasible. We have a lot more barriers than a research paper would show us. But it's understanding where those barriers are stemming from, and it's a delicate balance of communicating with the family on what could best serve the child, but also respecting their family and their culture at the same time.
Yeah. Cool. And what about sort of future directions in terms of the research, both in terms of sort of, what kind of came out of the study that's needed to be done, and also maybe what are kind of some of your hopes to do sort of continued work in this area?
Yeah. So there's not much research on this particular population as is. There are some studies on assessing like more of the cultural aspects of it, not the people and like what they think about the culture, but just like
Mm,
teasing out like what the culture actually is.
mm,
Some music, some literature, but nothing. I don't think there's much on the quantitative end of like, hey, we implemented this intervention with this specific population. So because the research was limited, that's kind of why I opted for the mixed methods route, where I can get that qualitative information from the group, but also have those numbers in. And I didn't have hopes that this was going to be like a life-changing intervention or study or anything like
mhm,
that.
mhm.
But as a field, we have to start somewhere. So if this could be used to build upon something else, that would be amazing. I would love to get back into it, hopefully get, like larger participant group sizes to redo like the semi-structured interviews. I think that would be great. I think for other researchers who may be interested in this type of work, it's a starting point. And that's the whole point of research, right? Like we go to one study, we kind of see what they did and then improve on that. My hope is to soon get back into research. I know it's a long process, but hopefully build up on this. I don't know that I would try the intervention as I had it built out with a 30-day curriculum. I don't know if I would do that the same. One, because all of the materials that I pulled for the guided mindfulness, they were coming from YouTube, and I know I had checked in on a couple of them, and they were taken down already. So just like for intervention effectiveness purposes, I know it wouldn't be feasible to do something like that. And that just made me think like maybe having a bank of my goal was to actually develop them myself, but because of time constraints and, like not knowing exactly what that would entail from like the development side of it, like I wouldn't know what to say in order to meet those different aspects of ACT. I think I would need to get in some like other trained researchers or like someone who already had experience in that to develop an actual set of 30 guided trainings so that we could have a bank of that on our own. I think that would be a cool idea. And then also the time component, I think 30 minutes ended up being too much for at least two of the participants. So maybe shortening the duration of the time commitment because they were daily requirements.
Did you get any feedback from the community on sort of the study and the results and the work? And
More so from the participants, yes. I think the group members found it valuable to connect with one another, even though it was virtual and, like everyone was kind of on their own. I could tell that, again, it was just meaningful to connect with one another, to share their experiences, to know that they weren't alone. And also seeing, I think for the parents too, having that community of like, hey, like you're not navigating this alone too. Like I'm going through the same struggles. I don't know if any of them, connected with one another afterwards, but seeing the depth of the conversations that they were having, I could tell that that was meaningful. And for the participants who were going through the ACT intervention, the third participant, the one who made the most meaningful gains, she actually reached out to me afterwards and she was like, I I wish like this was longer because, it was keeping me so focused. And all three of them, the ones who completed it, they all said that, it was meaningful for them, even though like the check-ins may not have like went the way they wanted it to, or specific benchmarks or whatever struggles they were having. Aside from that, they thought that the overall idea of it was impactful for each of them. So, even though they didn't meet maybe a benchmark goal, they felt like they were doing better or, they were happier. They felt like they were more on track. So subjectively, yes, I think both parts of the study were meaningful for the participants. And as a
I want to
researcher
share.
too, just having that third participant come back and like ask for it to be longer or you say that like they missed it, that, made the world of a difference. Like, okay, like this wasn't just an obligation for you. This is something that, could potentially be impactful to actually increase, valued living.
I wanted to shift gears a tiny bit away from the study and just ask a question that sort of came to me is around sort of behavior analysis and whatnot. Two questions. Just to your point, sort of about how, it's just an opportunity for folks to kind of get together and share experiences and share stories. Are there others had the opportunity to sort of make any of those kind of connections in the field? Like, are there other sort of Indo-Caribbean behavior analysts that you've been able to connect with? And is there an opportunity for, because I know there's obviously some larger groups for sort of some sort of bigger communities. So Baba's obviously a big one that a lot of folks know about. Just curious if there's been any of that in your experience.
I personally know two other Indo-Caribbean BCBAs.
Hmm.
One was a former supervisor who I didn't work with that company for a long time, and the other I just met socially, I think over last summer. And it's really nice because
Yeah.
there's not a lot of us, and I feel like this field is still so new that, compared to like nursing or other healthcare fields, you know, there's just not that awareness of like where you could potentially go with your education. So it's nice to see that we're getting a little bit more interest and yeah, it's amazing. The two that I know, I tried to connect with a little bit more, but I feel like our experiences across the board, not only with Indo-Caribbean people in this field, but just like behavior analysts in the field by itself, like we all connect pretty easily with one another because it can be such an isolating field, especially if you don't work in the clinical setting.
Because I mean, I know there are groups like the Caribbean ABA Association that recently formed, and
Mhm. And outside of behavior analysis, one of the groups that I've worked with before, they're called Brown Gal Diaries. They are a women-focused group, and I believe they're based out of Canada. And they focus on bringing providers together. So not only for behavior analysis, but they have a directory now of mental health clinicians, behavior
oh,
analysts, counselors. So they're
neat.
doing good work in terms of like gathering resources, putting things together, and then really showcasing what we could do as Caribbean descent providers within the field. So I like them a lot. They've been great for our community. And I know there's a lot of like smaller groups that are coming up and out now, again, on social media. I think has helped a lot with that, with just like showing people's backgrounds and showing, where we can kind of take our culture into the fields that we're working in.
Gotcha. And just one other tangent question, then I kind of just want to ask a little bit about what you're doing now before we wrap up. I've had a lot of conversations with behavior analysts sort of around the world, often first behavior analysts in some of these countries, and it's been really fascinating. Have you heard of or seen of any behavior analysis work happening in Guyana?
That is a great question. So before my dissertation, actually, I did some research on suicide in Guyana.
Mm,
So I don't believe it's the highest rate of suicide in the world anymore, but for a couple years it was. So
wow.
I did just kind of like a research summary based paper on that. And of course, with that, suicide is a behavior. So I kind of took a look at it from that perspective. And I ended up finding there is some research from Dr. Sarika Persad, and she implemented gatekeeper training with stakeholders in Guyana in order to identify those indicators of suicidal behavior. And that led me into seeing like if there were behavior analysts there. At least the last time I checked, which was either last year or the year before, there are no behavior analysts. And the way the country is right now is if you have neurodivergent children, adults,
Mm,
they're either seen as bad or that they need help. Because those services are not available, they're often sent to the hospital or like an asylum type of
yeah,
facility. I think there has been progress in that department where, gatekeeper trainings are coming in and they're just more education in terms of showing the teachers, like how to identify different signs, not only for suicide, but developmental disabilities, stuff like that. So I would love to like work with the university, the primary university down there, set up something, but I know like legal issues, and then, just like logistics of how that would work. I don't know, but I would love to be able to go down there, do trainings, set up some sort of internship program for individuals to be able to like get trained and certified. But again, I don't know how that will work logistically because then who's going to supervise them? I know there are no behavior analysts there because on the BACB website, you can't like click on Guyana. So I know there's no certified BCBAs. So again, if we have BTs down there now, then who is going to supervise them? Who's going to make sure, they're meeting their requirements?
yeah,
All of those little factors come into play. But I think gatekeeper training is the way to go. In terms of just like making bigger community like educational progress before getting into the logistics of individualized care. Because I don't think the country is there yet where we can feasibly and like intervene and like implement individualized care. I think community education and doing more, those big level whole group changes
yeah,
would be the way to start.
yeah. Neat. Okay, so what are some of the things you're doing right now? You said you recently started a new company. Tell me a little bit about that.
Here is your last secret word. The word is dynamic.
Yes. So I have a practice of my own. Um, I'm hoping to grow it into an interdisciplinary practice where I can bring on board social workers, speech therapists, OTs. I'm currently just focusing on building up the ABA department, and my primary focus with my own company right now is social skills. So having inclusion-based groups where either my clients on their own or other community members, whether or not they have an autism diagnosis, can come in. We work on functional skills, attending, just really having a safe place for children and, the parents too, where they can feel comfortable if we do have to manage behaviors, that we have trained staff on site to do that if needed. Because I feel like a lot of parents are interested in social skills type groups, but then they get nervous, about like taking their children out into the community where there may not be support because they don't know how their child is going to respond. So that's been a big part of what I've been doing in my own practice. And then I also work with another company as the training supervisor for the state. And in that company, I am primarily responsible for training and onboarding new staff. So kind of getting, people green to the field and making sure they're supported enough to transition into the role of being a behavior technician. And my caseload for that company is primarily in the school district. And the district that I'm assigned to, not a lot of English speaking families, having to work with students who want to have behavioral difficulties or concerns, but are also not speaking English. Yeah, which is good for me because I'm practicing Spanish a lot. And you could see, even at that level where they are communicating in Spanish and they assume that you don't know, and then you can understand them. I always tell everyone, it's like a little twinkle in their eyes because they're so used to not being understood,
Yeah.
even for simple words. And then when you do understand them, it's like a whole bank of like all of these responses that are coming out now.
Yes.
And one of the biggest things was during like FBAs and assessments where, they can send you into a school or work with a student that you haven't worked with before, is that we're assessing these kids in English. And it's showing on, let's say, VB Map, like they don't have
Right.
these level 1 skills, but was the assessor asking them in Spanish, in their primary language, if it's not Spanish? So I think like that was helpful for me as a BCBA clinically to be able to like kind of have that interaction, because then now I'm more cognizant of, hey, if I'm reading results, like, and I know I'm working in this school where most of the students are primarily Spanish speaking, maybe this is an issue of communication and language versus a skill deficit.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I really enjoy working in the school. So that's most of what I do with the other company. And I also teach master's students through the school that I graduated with my PhD from, who are currently accruing their hours for supervision.
Right on. Busy, busy, busy. Yeah. Fun.
I try.
Yeah. Good. Well, thanks, Vera. This was fascinating. It was really cool learning a lot about your culture and Guyana and all the great work you're doing. Yeah. Thanks for coming on. Super cool.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. Awesome.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation. For more episodes like this, I encourage you to check out episode 108 with Dr. Naima Bana Lopez, culturally affirming special education in Panama and Muslim culture, and episode 93, Behavior Analysis in the Caribbean with Kim Woolery, Gabby Torres, and Sloan Farr-Strang.
If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please follow us on Instagram @BehaviorSpeak.